Come closer. Not because it's safer here, it isn't. But because this one starts not with a scream, but with a mountain tearing itself open. Before the cameras, before the warnings nailed to trees, there was only fire. And then, centuries later, silence where the fire had been. In the year 864, by the reckoning we now use, Mount Fuji split along its northwestern flank and let the earth beneath it out. Historians call it the Jogan eruption, a clean name for an unclean thing. The chronicles of the time, sparse as they are, describe the sky over the province turning the color of an old bruise, ash falling for days on villages that had no word yet for what was happening to them. For weeks the mountain did not stop. Molten rock moved across the lowlands the way water moves, except that water does not remember its shape once it settles, and lava does. It found the low places and filled them. A lake is recorded as having been swallowed whole, its waters boiled and buried in the same afternoon. It found the forests that had stood there and ended them without ceremony. Trees turned to standing char before they had time to fall. When it finally cooled, what remained was not land in any familiar sense. It was stone, black and porous and endless, stretching out where trees and streams and villages had been, cooling into ridges and hollows that still hold the shape of the flow, frozen mid-motion like something caught in the act of moving. For a long while, nothing grew there, nothing could. The ground was too young, too raw, too recently made, still warm in places long after the fire itself had gone quiet. Ash settled where ash falls, and the wind moved over bare rock with nothing to catch it, no leaf, no blade of grass, nothing to slow it down. Travelers who passed the edges of that scar, in the years just after, must have looked at it the way one looks at a wound that hasn't decided whether to close, raw at the edges, uncertain in the middle, wrong in a way that doesn't need explaining. A forest cannot grow on stone that has not finished dying, and yet in time, one did. It took centuries, but the trees came back, not gently, not the way forests usually arrive, spreading soft roots into soft earth, patient and unremarkable. Here the rock underneath left no real soil to speak of, only a thin, ungenerous skin over hardened lava, and so the trees did something stranger. Their roots reached out instead of down, crawling along the surface in long, arthritic tangles, gripping stone, because there was nothing beneath to grip, twisting over one another in shapes no forester elsewhere would recognize as natural. Walk into that forest today, and the ground itself looks unwell, roots knuckled and raised, looping over one another like something trying to hold itself together, like fingers laced in a grip that has forgotten how to let go. Seen from above, from a ridge or a low plain, the canopy folds into a flat, seamless green, so uniform that early observers likened it to a sea, unbroken, without landmark, without a single tree that distinguishes itself from its neighbors. That is where the name comes from, the Sea of Trees, and it is not poetic exaggeration. It is what it looks like, from far enough away to be beautiful. But go beneath that canopy, and the resemblance to an ocean turns unsettling in a different way, because the volcanic rock underfoot absorbs sound the way sand absorbs footsteps, and more. A voice raised inside that forest does not carry the way a voice should. It drops, flattens, dies within a few paces, as though the air itself has decided not to participate. Visitors across generations, long before any of this had a modern reputation, wrote of the same thing independently. A quiet that did not feel like the absence of noise. A forest that swallows sound is a forest that swallows more than sound. And something about that made even the earliest travelers uneasy. The kind of unease that doesn't announce itself, that simply sits at the back of the neck and stays there, because the same iron-rich stone that shaped the roots also did something to the compasses. This part is documented, not invented. The rock beneath Aokigahara carries enough magnetized volcanic material to disturb a compass needle at close range, sometimes enough to make the needle wander uselessly. swinging in slow circles as though searching for a direction that no longer exists. Sometimes not, the effect uneven, unpredictable, present in one clearing and absent 20 paces on. Geologists still debate how strong the effect truly is, whether it's enough on its own to explain the long history of travelers losing their bearings in there, or whether the deeper cause was simply density, trees so close together, ground so uneven, light so filtered through that thick, unbroken canopy, that direction became difficult by ordinary means alone, no compass required. But the reputation came first, and the explanation came later, the way it so often does. Old regional maps marked the forest not with names of villages or landmarks, but with a kind of practical caution. Difficult terrain, easy to walk into, hard to walk back out of in a straight line. The cartographer's ink doing the work a warning sign would later do. If the ground lies to your instruments, what else in that silence might it be lying about? You know this feeling even if you've never held a compass in your life. It's the moment you turn around in a room you know well, and for half a second can't remember which way is out. The wall suddenly unfamiliar, the door somehow on the wrong side of the room. That flicker, small, quickly dismissed, never quite forgotten, is what an entire forest full of travelers felt for centuries. Now walk back in with me. Long before any of this reached the wider world, the people who lived near the forest already told a story about it, passed the way old stories are passed, mouth to mouth, generation folding into generation, no author, no date, no single voice to credit or blame. The story held that Aokigahara, or forests like it, had once been used for ubasute, the practice, spoken of in various regions of Japan during hard famine years, of leaving the elderly or the infirm in remote places to die, because there was no food left to keep them alive, and a village facing starvation had to choose, brutally, who among them would be fed, and who would not. It is important to say plainly what is true and what is not. There is no solid documentary record tying this specific practice to this specific forest. It is folklore, not history. But a story doesn't need to be proven to take root. And this one had 13 centuries of dark, quiet, root-choked ground to grow in. It grew anyway, the way stories do in places where the silence leaves room for them, filling the empty air the trees themselves would not. Through the long stretch of the Edo period, the written record treats the forest with a kind of practical indifference. It appears in regional accounts mostly as an obstacle, dense, resource-poor, unfit for farming, a place to rout around rather than settle, a blank space at the edge of otherwise carefully surveyed land. Small shrines and markers were placed at its margins over the years, modest stone and wood, the kind of quiet gestures people make toward places they respect without wanting to enter. Offerings left less out of fear than out of habit, the way one nods toward something old without quite knowing why. For most of its long history, this was simply an obscure forest, known to those nearby, unremarkable to anyone else, absent from the poetry and the pilgrimage routes that made Fuji itself famous. Obscurity doesn't last forever. Something was coming that would drag this quiet forest into the light. That something arrived in the early 1960s, in the pages of a popular Japanese novel whose final act sent its central character walking them to Aokigahara to end their life. It was fiction. It was also, in the way fiction sometimes is, a kind of key that fit a lock nobody had noticed before. The book's popularity is well documented, and so is what followed, a measurable shift in how the forest was spoken of nationally. The association between this specific place and this specific ending settling into the public mind with unusual speed, faster than the folklore ever had, faster than the geology, faster than 1,000 years of quiet indifference. In the years after, recorded incidents in the forest are documented to have risen. What had been private, local, folkloric, hardened into something closer to common knowledge, a place with a purpose now attached to it that it had never asked for, a reputation the trees themselves had done nothing to earn. Fiction had planted the idea. What the authorities did next is a matter of public record, and it changed the forest's edges forever. Yamanashi Prefecture, the region containing the forest, began placing signs at its entrances, not warnings of wildlife or weather, but something quieter and heavier, appeals to reconsider, some invoking family, invoking the life a person had been given rather than taken, phrased gently, deliberately, the way one speaks to someone standing on a ledge rather than someone merely lost. Volunteer patrols formed. Periodic searches became routine, conducted without spectacle for years by people who did this work without expecting anyone outside the prefecture to ever hear of it, walking the same root-choked ground season after season, quietly, unglamorously, because someone had to. This period of the forest's history is administrative, somber, procedural, almost nothing like the sensational version that would later spread once cameras and then the internet discovered it existed. For decades, this was a private grief, managed quietly by a prefecture, and known mostly to those who lived near it, spoken of in hushed practical terms rather than horror story ones. Then the story left Japan entirely. By the time international attention found Aokigahara, it was already carrying more than 1,000 years underneath it. The geology of a mountain's violence, centuries of half-proven folklore, decades of documented and quietly managed modern sorrow, and one novel's fictional ending that had reshaped all of it in the public mind. None of that layered weight survived the crossing into viral video and thumbnail horror. The forest became a dare, a punchline, a location tagged and filmed by people who, by and large, knew almost nothing of what came before them, who walked in with cameras raised and left having learned nothing true about the ground beneath their feet. What remains underneath all of it hasn't changed. It is still simply a very old and very quiet forest, growing on rock that was once fire. The mountain that made it is still there. So is the silence. Only the audience has changed. Every forest has a birthday. Most people never think to ask this one's, because by the time they arrive, it has already been made into something simpler than the truth. The truth took 1,000 years to grow, root by root, over stone that had to cool before anything could take hold in it at all. The story you were told took a weekend. Some stories survive because they're entertaining. Others survive because they're true enough to matter. You decide which this was. I've told this one before. I'll tell it again after you've gone.